Hello, and welcome to Finale to Dorico, Conquering the Transition. My name is Jason Lafredo, and I'll be your guide today as we explore some of the similarities and differences between setting up your scores in Finale and in Dorico. More specifically, we're going to be looking at Dorico's setup mode. Now, I have the Steinberg hub opened here initially because I want to show you something. This file that I've already created, this was directly from the Steinberg hub. I did add a few things in it just to demonstrate a couple other things later on, but it's basically an orchestral template. It's the concert orchestra template. I set it up exactly like this. So when I press create project, I'm basically going to get this. But I wanted to point out one feature here. There's this option here, project will use multiple flows. So if you know for a fact that your piece is going to use multiple movements, I highly suggest that you check this. What this will do is it will automatically create the flow headings that you're going to need for the movement titles, right? If you know that your piece is only going to be one movement, uncheck that because then it won't create those flow headings. Of course, you can always change this later, but you have to go through the layout options and add some stuff. So it's much easier to do it this way if you're starting with one of these templates. So anyway, I had checked this, I had created the new project, and that's where we are. The first thing we want to deal with is instruments, right? So you know in Finale, you go into the score manager, you're in the instrument list, and this is where you're going to deal with changing instruments or adding instruments or dealing with the staff labels. Down on the bottom right, we have notation styles. You can set up percussion staves. You have your transposition staff lines and your first clef. This is where you're setting all this up. But this is where basically we would add and change instruments in Finale. In Dorico, we do that all in setup mode, specifically in the left column. Except that Dorico doesn't call them instruments, it calls them players for a very specific reason. Now these players can be single players or section players, and you know the difference because there's a little icon here, it's like a little shadow person. If it's a singular shadow person, this is a single player. Down here in the string section, you see that I have a little double person right there. That means that this is a section player. Now single players and section players have different qualities and parameters. I'll get into that in a second, but if you want to add more players, there's a couple buttons here on the bottom. This one is add single player, this is add section player, and there are shortcuts for those. To add a single player, just select Shift P, and what will happen is you'll get an empty-handed player that gets added to the bottom for now, but you'll also get this window where you can choose a new instrument for that player. So let's choose the English horn. Now you can go through here and search through the woodwinds and find the English horn, but the truth is there's a lot of instruments that Dorico defines. So I find the easiest thing to do is to just start typing, which will narrow it down. And you usually only need a few letters to get to the one that you need, and you just press add. And now your English horn appears in the correct spot in the players. It's in correct score order, so you're good to go. If you wanted to add an additional section player, it's Option Shift P, and it will do the same thing, except now you're adding an empty-handed section player, and we could do the same thing. I don't know, let's add a second viola section, because why not? And you'll see indeed that we now have two viola section players, except I'm going to undo that. Now there's some big differences between the single players and the section players. Primarily the single players can hold multiple instruments. And if you actually press this arrow key here, you're going to see the instrument that the flute 1 player is holding. So the flute 1 player is holding the flute 1 instrument, right? But you can actually add instruments to this player. You do that by pressing this plus button or Shift I. And actually I'm going to do this to the flute 2 because I want the flute 2 to double piccolo, right? So I'm just going to select the flute 2, press Shift I. You're going to get the same window. I'm going to search for piccolo. It's going to show up. It's going to be selected for me. I'm going to add. And now this player is called Flute 2 and Piccolo. And if I press that arrow, you'll see that this player is now holding two instruments, Flute 2 and Piccolo. This is primarily why Dorico calls this players, because it's not exactly precise to call it instruments, because this one player is holding multiple instruments, right? Now this is essentially how you're going to deal with doubling in Dorico. In Finale, as you know, if I just go here, you can zoom in a little bit here. I've got some notes in my Flute 2 player, right? If I wanted the Flute 2 to switch to Piccolo, at this point, we know that we just select that measure, we go to Utilities, we go to Change Instrument, we find the Piccolo, we click OK, and it sort of makes the transition for you. Now, it doesn't add labels. This is something you have to do manually in the Expression tool, but it will eventually change the staff label to Piccolo on the next system, right? This is how we do instrument changes in Finale. But the thing is that in Finale, it's still a single staff. You have one staff that goes through the whole piece. It's just that the instrument gets changed as you go, right? It's different in Dorico. The way that Dorico works is that the player is always holding those two instruments, and there's two staffs that exist. Except if you look at it, there's really only one staff. It's just the flute two-player staff. The way that Dorico does this is that in page view, Dorico will only show one instrument at a time, but they both exist. You have to go to galley view to see that they're both there, right? And this is how you'd actually deal with this. So I have the same notes in this file in Dorico. They're both in flute 2 right now, but what I can do is actually move these notes here into the piccolo part. So if I go into write mode, I'm going to select these measures here. Quick bonus tip, completely unrelated, Option M will move pitches from one staff to the staff below it. Option N will go up, Option M will go down. And so now you can see that those pitches are now in the piccolo staff. So it kind of looks like there is two staffs for the two instruments of this one player. If we go back to page view, you'll see that Dorico handles the switch automatically. Here it is, the flute 2 parts, and it gives you the piccolo label automatically, and on the next system you see the piccolo label, right? This is how Dorico handles doubling instruments. It's one player with holding multiple instruments. There's also options for how the labels are appearing. You can add 2 labels here and everything. Some of those options are in the engraving options under instrument changes. There's a couple options here, but there's more under the layout options. Under players, under instrument changes, you can select a few ideas about how those labels should appear, whether or not the 2 instrument appears and all that stuff. So there are some options that will dictate how Dorico is automatically doing this. But the bottom line is that it's set up in setup mode where you have to add instruments to the player like this. Section players have different properties. The section players can't hold multiple instruments, which kind of makes sense. You don't want your violin one section holding piccolos, right? But there is something else that section instruments can do, which is divisi. So if you have section instruments set up, there's a way in Dorico to write some notes on a single staff, and then at a certain point you can divide that into multiple staffs. So you can divide your violin 1 into 2, 3, 4 staffs, and you can freely go back and forth between 1, 2, or 3, 4 staffs as needed using that divisi feature. I'm not going to get into that here. There's a great tutorial that Dorico did. Hopefully we can link to that video so you can learn more about how this works. But the point is that you can only use that divisi feature on section players, right? You can't use the divisi feature on single players because obviously that wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't divisi a single player. Again, just a big difference between the section player and the single players. The other difference is that the section player sounds will be sections of instruments. So there will be a different sound for a single violin 1 player versus a section violin 1 player. So that's also another consideration. The other thing that you can do with these players, which is kind of neat, is that if you select any one of them and just right click, you will get some contextual options here, which I'll get into a little bit. But the first one is soloist. So you can turn any single player into a soloist, and that will now be called solo bass trombone. And it will also put it above the strings, which is a typical place you'd put a solo instrument in a concerto. So not that we'd really want a bass trombone concerto, but you could do that just by doing that. You can also reorder these instruments pretty easily. So if I wanted to reorder my percussion a little bit, all you have to do is just drag them into place and they'll move. Now, one thing about this, at the bottom here, you'll notice where it says order, and now it says none. After I had made that change, it now says none. If we select this, there's some options here. I can go back to the orchestral score order, and it's going to put that instrument where Dorico wants to put it by default. As soon as you move a player like that, it basically is now a custom score order, and so that's why it says none. So just be aware of this. So whenever you add instruments, when this order says none, it's always going to add them to the bottom. So you're going to have to kind of manually move them to where you want them, unless you go back and choose that as orchestral, and then you can kind of start over and make any changes that you want. The players themselves can also be renamed a couple different ways. If you right click, you can actually choose the rename player here, and we can call this percussion 1. You can also change the short name, although this would only affect things if you're using the player name for the staff labels instead of the instrument names, which you can do. Or you can just double click and just start typing. We'll do that here. So we can call all of these percussion players percussion 1, 2, and 3. And incidentally, when you do this, when you change the players over here, it will also change the layout names, which is kind of nice. You can see now that they're called percussion 1, 2, and 3. This only works if you had not made any changes to the names of the layouts. If I had already custom named this something else, then changing the player name would not change this. But if they're still linked in that way, changing the player names will also change the layout names. However, notice that when I did that, it didn't change that here in the score. This is still saying side drum, clash cymbal, and bass drum. This is due to the difference, again, between the players and the instruments. So percussion 1 is holding the side drum instrument. Percussion 2 is holding the clash cymbal instrument, right? It's the instrument names in this case that are being used as the staff labels. But again, we can also change those right here. So if we wanted to rename clash cymbal Piatti, you'd press the 3 buttons here and choose the edit names. And you can do that in this window. We'll call this Piatti. And the shortcut, I think, is PTTI, I believe. And when you do that, now the Piatti will appear in the score as you want it, and the abbreviated version will be there as well. So again, just a little bit of a difference between instruments and players here and how they function. And as I mentioned, when you right-click an instrument, you do get a bunch of other options. We've talked about the first 2, actually the first 3. This is adding an instrument to a player. I'll talk about groups in a second. Flows and layouts I'll talk about in a second. But you can duplicate, delete a player the same way you just select and delete. But there's also things for chord symbols here, which is of interesting to note that in Dorico, chord symbols are considered primarily a system object, which means that all you have to do is just type the chords on one particular staff, and they will appear on whatever staff you want them to, based on how they're set up in setup mode. So for each player, you can tell it to show the chords in certain ways in the score and the parts, etc. So there's a little bit of flexibility here. Of course, you can always have different chords. There's a different way to do that, a little bit beyond the scope of this. But just know that chords are actually part of setup mode in an interesting way. You can also do things with percussion kits and all that stuff. Again, maybe perhaps in a future video we'll get to this kind of stuff. But anyway, this is all the things that are available for the players in setup mode. And I wanted to show you one other thing about the players. If I select all of my brass, for example, down at the bottom here, I think it's the 4th button, add group. If we select that, what we're doing is we're adding a group, and you get this big group label. Currently it's called group 1. Of course, I can rename that, call that brass. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want to do this on a traditional score. There's no need for this, but you can see how valuable this would be if you had a piece with like multiple different choirs. You can actually group them like this and give them a different name. So that's a neat little feature that's really easy to do with that Add Groups button. Just undo both of those. And so all this time, you note that the score here is showing individual staffs for all of these instruments, right? Flute 1, 2, oboe 1, 2, the individual staffs, right? But what if you wanted a shared staff situation where you want one staff for flute 1 and 2, one staff for oboe 1 and 2, etc., right? In Finale, you probably know that in order to do that, you'd have to kind of like eliminate the second flute staff here and then rename this flute 1/2 or something. And then you have to go into the manage parts window and add a second part and then do something with the edit voicing window. And or like you have to add extra hidden staffs. It's kind of a manual pain in the neck in Finale. But in Dorico, it handles it automatically. And it's literally just a toggle. So if I actually go to write mode, in the edit menu, about 2/3 of the way down, there's this condensing option. And when you select that, look what happens. All of the instruments get combined. So the flute 1 and 2 gets combined into a single staff, clarinets, bassoons, etc. Let me just undo that. And the way that this works is that if I scroll over here, I have some measures of notes in my clarinets and bassoons, and I'll do that one more time. You can see I have individual parts for both clarinets and both bassoons. But if we turn on condensing, what it will do is it will combine them together, and it will combine them intelligently, whether it's in one voice or in multiple voices. So this is a really neat feature. But basically know that Dorico does this automatically. And there's something important to understand about condensing off the bat. In the write mode, you can actually write in a staff that's a single player or a single instrument. So I can double click in my English horn staff to get notes there. But if I tried to double click in a condensed staff, it won't let me. The trick to Dorico is that you can't write in condensed staffs. You have to write in the open scoring and then allow Dorico to automatically condense for you. So now I can write in the clarinet staff and everything. So it is a little bit backwards from Finale, where you're writing in the combined staffs and then parsing it out later. In Dorico, it's the complete opposite. You're writing in the individual staffs and allowing Dorico to condense automatically. Again, there's a lot more to condensing. Hopefully we can add some links in the description to some more videos about condensing, because it is a really nifty feature. Now in Finale, you know that like if you go into the score manager and you start adding instruments, it's going to automatically add parts here, linked parts. And of course you can go to your manage parts window and rename them and do special things in this window, right? Again, in Dorico, it's all done in setup mode, this time on the right side of the window. This is where all of your layouts exist, or what they would be linked parts in Finale, right? Of course, we can rename these the same way we rename players, so we can call this concert score if we wanted to. They can be moved, deleted in the same way. And we can also add new layouts. At the bottom of this section, there is this button which says add full score layout. We can also add instrumental part layouts. We can add custom score layouts. You can add extra full score layouts. So if you wanted a condensed score and an uncondensed score, you could do that. You could have a concert pitch score and a transposed score. You can have 4 different scores if you wanted to. You can also do things with piano vocal scores and stuff like that. Same thing with parts. So in this case, I'm actually going to add an instrumental part layout, and it will put an empty part at the bottom. I'm going to call this percussion score. We're going to make a percussion score here. But the thing is, there's nothing in this percussion score. And so let me just point out one thing about how this window works. So if you select something on the right, as soon as you select it, you'll see on the left a whole bunch of things get checked, which means that everything that's checked on the left column is appearing in this layout. If I select flute 1, you only see flute 1 because only the flute 1 instrument is in the flute 1 layout. Same thing here, right? So for my percussion score, there's nothing selected. So I have to select something. So what I can do is actually select all 3 percussion parts just like that. And now this percussion score actually is a percussion score with those 3 instruments. We can kind of move this. Let's move this to below the timpani. And indeed, if I go up here, I can now find my percussion score, which has all 3 staffs in it. So that's sort of how that works. If I wanted to, I can then, of course, delete. I can delete these 3 layouts. And when you delete layouts, you don't get that warning because you're not actually deleting the data or the players. You're just deleting the layout. And in fact, the data from those players exist in the percussion score anyway. There's some other options here. If you right-click, of course, you can rename, you can renumber. This will take you directly to the layout options for that. Incidentally, this is a good trick. Like if you want to go to the layout options for the percussion score, go to setup mode, make sure you have percussion score chosen, and then do that shortcut Command-Shift-L, and it will ensure that the percussion score is highlighted in the layout options. A nice little trick there. You can also propagate parts formatting. By the way, this is actually equivalent to the JW copy part layout plugin in Finale. This does the same thing. It's just called propagate parts formatting. It's built into the setup mode. So there you go. You can also do things with clef and transposition overrides, flow heading overrides. You can deal with flows and players, delete and duplicate the layout, all in this contextual menu here. And also, if you pull down the arrow here, this will give you a quick view of what the page size is and the space size. You can see them different between the concert score and the flute, so that's handy as well. And then let's talk about flows on the bottom here. This is completely unique to Dorico. Finale doesn't have anything like this. Any of the other notation software doesn't have anything like this either. Flows are basically movements, right? And Dorico does a brilliant thing with how it sets up with flow titles, and when you add new flows, it will put it on the page in a certain way. It's really kind of slick, but you can certainly add more flows if you need to. In the bottom section here, it's this top button right here. You press that, and it will add a new flow. You can rename these, of course. Let's rename this Allegro. For flow 1, let's call flow 2 Scherzo. The other way to add flows, Shift F will also add a flow. And let's call this Andante. And what's really cool, if I zoom out a little bit, you can kind of see all three flows. Now, when you add flows, it's only going to add like this one single bar with a single rest. There's not even a time signature or key signature here. So eventually you can add more, and this will take up more pages. But what's really cool is that you can reorder these just by dragging them. So my andante now becomes my second movement. My scherzo becomes my third movement. And this works brilliantly. Like if you have the whole piece worked out and all the pages are worked out, you just flip the flows and it just reorders them, which is kind of nice. The other thing you can do here, if you press Command I to get to the project info, the project info is where you're going to have all these tokens that will be filled out in engrave mode with the page layouts. Hopefully I'm going to get into some lessons about that as well at some point, but these are where those tokens exist, and there's different tokens for the project and the flow, so you can have individual subtitles or composers per flow. So there's a lot of different types of tokens that you can have here. But also in this window, you can also add flows at the bottom just by pressing that button, and you can rename this. We'll call this Presto. And then as soon as you hit apply, it will add all of that and close it, and now you have your new flow here as well. And again, easy to just completely reorder them however you need to. And then the last thing I want to do, I want to talk about what I'm calling the setup mode matrix. I kind of alluded to this already with the percussion score, but when you click the percussion score, you're seeing the players that exist, right? It works all the way around this window. So if I choose a player, I'm going to see exactly which layouts exist. If I choose a layout, I'm going to see what players exist. If I choose a flow, I'm going to see which players and which layouts are included in that flow. And you can deselect things at will here. So, for example, if I don't need my English horn in the andante movement, I could select the andante movement and uncheck the English horn over on the left. And if you look at the score, here's a third movement. The scherzo movement does have the English horn, but the andante movement does not have the English horn. So you can exclude certain instruments in this way from certain flows. The other thing that you can do is also exclude flows from certain layouts. So if I don't want to show the andante movement in the score for whatever reason, I just uncheck it and it'll go right to the third movement. I'll still have the andante movement everywhere else. It just won't show up in the score. There's a ton of flexibility here, and in fact, let me just show you on the English horn part. If I zoom out, normally when you have a bunch of measures, first of all, if there's nothing in it, you'll just get a long tacit. Otherwise, it will be actual measures of music. This is what it's going to kind of look like. Sometimes these flows will end up on the same page. Sometimes they'll be on new pages, etc. But again, with checking and unchecking something, if I were to select the English horn here and uncheck the andante, you see what happens here is that the andante actually gets the plain tacit without the measures. So that's one way to do that. The other thing that you can do is if you choose the English horn layout and deselect the andante, it actually just goes away. So you're actually skipping over the second movement. So there's a little bit of interesting flexibility in terms of how these checkboxes work related to each other. So again, it's sort of a matrix of options. Select one thing, deselect other things, select another thing, deselect other things to get what you want. All right, so I think that's all I have today on setup mode. Hopefully this covers a lot and you've got a good idea about how this works, how it's different from Finale, and you're well on your way. So thanks for watching this. I believe the next video we're going to dive right into write mode, dealing with note and rest input and things of that sort. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks for watching this one, and I will see you soon.